Esinam was excited to start her new life with Kwabena. She believed marriage was about love, respect, and building a home together. But from the moment she stepped into her husband's family house, she realized she wasn't just a wife, she was expected to be a servant. Madame Ya, her mother-in-law, didn't smile or welcome her like a daughter. Instead, she handed Esinam a piece of paper filled with rules. "These are the duties of a good wife," she said firmly. Esinam read the list, her heart sinking. She was never to eat before Madame Ya, never to speak unless spoken to, and most importantly, she had to remember that her husband's mother always came first. This wasn't the life Esinam had imagined, but she had no idea how much worse it would get. Esinam woke up before the sun every morning, hurrying to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for the entire household. Madame Ya never lifted a finger. She simply sat in her large chair, barking orders like a queen. "Make the soup spicier," she would say. "Wash my clothes by hand, not in that lazy machine. Bring my water. I will not get up myself." Day after day, Esinam cooked, cleaned, and served guests. Yet no matter how hard she worked, it was never enough. If the food was perfect, Madame Ya found something else to complain about. If Esinam finished cleaning, Madame Ya would make her do it all over again, just to remind her who was in charge. Kwabena, the man Esinam had married with love in her heart, never defended her. Instead, he nodded along with his mother's commands, acting as if this was the way things should be. "You should be grateful," he told Esinam once. "My mother is teaching you how to be a good wife." Esinam swallowed her pain, thinking that maybe, just maybe, things would change. But she was wrong. One evening, after a long day of chores, Esinam was finally about to sit down and rest when Madame Ya pointed at her feet. "Kneel down and massage them," she ordered. Esinam looked at her, tired and frustrated. "I'm sorry, but my back hurts. I have been working all day." The room fell silent. Madame Ya's eyes darkened with anger. "You dare refuse me?" Kwabena, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up. "Esinam, do as my mother says." Esinam shook her head. "I am not a slave. I am your wife." Before she could say another word, a sharp slap landed across her face. Her head jerked to the side, and for a moment she could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears. Kwabena stood over her, his face twisted with rage. "If you cannot respect my mother, then leave my house." Esinam touched her burning cheek, shocked. "Kwabena, you're throwing me out. You brought this on yourself," he said coldly. Madame Ya smirked, satisfied. "A woman who disrespects her husband's mother does not belong in this family." Esinam stared at the two of them, heartbroken. She had given everything to this home. She had cooked, cleaned, and suffered in silence, all for the sake of love. And yet, in one moment, she was being tossed away like garbage. Without another word, she walked to the door. No bag, no money, nothing. Just the clothes on her back and the pain in her heart. As she stepped outside, the night sky rumbled. Moments later, heavy rain began to fall, soaking her instantly. She turned around one last time, hoping, praying that Kwabena would stop her. But the door slammed shut in her face. Tears mixed with the rain as she stood in the dark, cold and alone. She had lost everything, or so she thought. The cold rain poured down, soaking Esinam's clothes and mixing with the tears on her face. She stood motionless, staring at the heavy wooden door that had just been slammed shut in her face. This was the same door she had walked through as a happy bride, full of love and dream. Now she was nothing more than an outsider, thrown away like she didn't matter. The grand mansion behind her stood tall, its golden lights glowing through the windows. Inside, Kwabena and his mother were probably sitting in warmth and comfort, not giving her a second thought. This was the home she had helped build with love, hard work, and sacrifice. And now, she had been pushed out of it with nothing. Her fingers trembled as she hugged herself for warmth. "Where will I go?" she whispered into the night. The streets were empty. The world was asleep. For a moment, fear gripped her chest. She had no money, no bag, no one waiting for her. But then, a small voice inside her spoke, soft yet strong. "This is not the end." Esinam straightened her back, blinking away the tears. She had given this marriage everything. She had cooked, cleaned, and obeyed every unreasonable demand. She had suffered in silence, hoping love would be enough. But love was not enough, not when it came with pain, humiliation, and betrayal. No more. She took one last look at the house, not with sadness, but with finality. This was no longer her home. With slow, steady steps, she turned and walked away. The rain continued to pour, but she no longer felt the cold. Her heart, though broken, burned with something new, strength. She would not beg. She would not turn back. This was not the end. This was just the beginning. Esinam walked through the empty streets, her clothes soaked, her heart heavy. The rain had stopped, but the night was still cold. Every step felt harder than the last, but she refused to stop. She had no home, no money, and no idea where to go. Yet, deep inside, she knew there was one person who would not turn her away. Auntie Afia. She had been more than just a neighbor when Esinam was a child. She had been a mentor, a second mother, a guiding light. Esinam hadn't seen her in a while, but at this moment she had nowhere else to turn. By the time she reached Auntie Afia's small but welcoming home, the sky was beginning to lighten. She hesitated at the door, suddenly afraid. What if Auntie Afia told her to leave? What if she, too, said Esinam had no place to go? Before she could knock, the door creaked open. Auntie Afia stood there, her eyes widening in shock. Esinam, child, what happened to you? At the sound of her name spoken with kindness, all the strength Esinam had been holding on to broke. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, I have nowhere else to go. Without another word, Auntie Afia pulled her inside, wrapping her in a warm embrace. The house smelled of herbs and fresh bread, a comforting scent that reminded Esinam of childhood. Auntie Afia led her to a chair by the fire, handing her a dry cloth to wipe her face. She didn't ask questions immediately. She simply poured Esinam a cup of hot tea and waited. When Esinam finally found her voice, she told her everything. How she had loved Kwabena, how she had tried to be the perfect wife, how Madame Yar had treated her like a servant, how she had been thrown out into the night with nothing. Auntie Afia listened without interrupting, her face calm but her eyes full of fire. When Esinam finished, Auntie Afia reached for her hand and squeezed it gently. You are not weak, Esinam, she said firmly. A storm only bends the strongest trees, but it does not break them. Esinam sniffled. I feel broken. Auntie Afia shook her head. No, child, you feel lost, but lost is not the same as broken. You are still standing, aren't you? Esinam nodded slowly. Then you will rise again. The words settled deep in Esinam's heart. She had been cast out, humiliated, left with nothing. But was she truly nothing? No. She still had her hands, her mind, her determination. She would not stay defeated. That night, for the first time in a long time, Esinam slept peacefully, not as a servant, not as a woman desperate for love, but as a woman who was ready to start again. Esinam woke up to the smell of warm porridge and fresh bread. Sunlight streamed through the small window, filling the room with a soft glow. For the first time in a long time, she felt safe. She was no longer in a house where she was treated like a servant. She was in a home where she was loved. Auntie Afia placed a bowl of porridge in front of her. Eat, child, she said with a gentle smile. Esinam took a bite. The warmth of the food spread through her body, giving her strength. But her heart was still heavy. What will I do now? She whispered. Auntie Afia sat across from her, watching her closely. What do you want to do? Esinam thought about it. She could cry over what happened. She could sit in anger, wishing for revenge on Kwabena and his mother. But what would that change? No, she didn't want revenge. She wanted a life that made her forget she ever needed it. I want to build something for myself, she said. I want to stand on my own. Auntie Afia nodded. Then start with what you have. Esinam had only a small amount of saving, but she had something even more valuable, her skills. She'd spent years cooking for Kwabena's family, preparing meals that guests praised but never gave her credit for. She knew how to make food that people loved, and now she would make it for herself. She used the little money she had to buy ingredients and a small wooden cart. It wasn't much, but it was enough. On the first day, she set up her food stand near a busy street corner. She cooked jollof rice, grilled chicken, and fried plantain. The smell filled the air, drawing people in. At first, only a few stopped to try her food, but after one bite, they came back with friends. Then strangers started lining up. Word spread fast. Have you tasted the jollof from that small stand near the market? The woman there cooks better than any restaurant in town. Within weeks, Esinam's food stand was always busy. She woke up before sunrise to cook, worked all day, and saved every coin she earned. Then came the day a man in a suit approached her stand. He wasn't like the regular customers. He watched her cook, then smiled. "I've been hearing about your food everywhere," he said. "The mayor is hosting an event next month. He only wants the best caterer in Accra. Would you be interested?" Esinam almost dropped the plate she was holding. The mayor? She looked at her tiny stand, then back at the man. She had started with nothing, and now the most powerful people in the city wanted her food. She took a deep breath and smiled. "Tell the mayor I'll be there." This wasn't revenge. This was her victory. The night was alive with laughter, music, and the soft clinking of glasses. The mayor's grand banquet was the biggest event of the year, held in the most luxurious hotel in Accra. The city's richest and most powerful people filled the hall, dressed in their finest clothes, ready to enjoy an unforgettable evening. But none of them knew the real surprise of the night. Behind the scenes, Esinam stood tall in her crisp white chef's coat, watching as her team plated the final dishes. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from excitement. She had worked hard for this moment. Just months ago, she had been thrown out like trash, left with nothing. Now she was here, catering the most important event in the city. "Madam Esinam, we're ready," one of her staff whispered. She nodded and stepped forward, leading her team as they carried the beautifully prepared meals into the grand hall. As she walked in, the golden chandeliers above sparkled like stars, and the scent of her delicious food filled the air. People turned their heads, curious about the mastermind behind the feast, and then her eyes landed on them. Kwabena, Madam Ya, sitting right at the front table, laughing, drinking, completely unaware of who had prepared their meal. Esinam felt her chest tighten, but she quickly steadied herself. She was not the weak, broken woman they had thrown out. She was stronger now. She was successful, and tonight, she was the one in control. One of the waiters placed a plate in front of Kwabena. He picked up his fork and took a bite. His eyes widened, and he turned to his mother. "This jollof, it tastes exactly like..." Madam Ya frowned as she took a spoonful of the soup. "This is familiar." Before they could finish their thoughts, the mayor stood up, raising his glass for a toast. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice filling the room, "tonight, we celebrate not just success, but the people who make it possible. And there is one person we must all thank for this unforgettable meal." The hall grew silent. All eyes turned to the stage. Esinam stepped forward. Kwabena choked on his drink. Madam Ya gasped. It was as if time had stopped. "Please welcome the finest chef in the city, the woman behind this evening's masterpiece, Madam Esinam." The hall erupted into applause. People cheered, clapped, and murmured in admiration. Esinam picked up the microphone, her voice calm but firm. "I was once told I had no place in my own home, that I was not worthy unless I obeyed without question." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But tonight, I stand here not as a servant, not as someone begging for love, but as a woman who built her own empire." Gasps filled the room. The whispers turned into loud admiration. Kwabena's face burned with shame. Madam Ya sat frozen, her hand gripping the tablecloth. Esinam looked directly at them, her smile never fading. They had tried to break her, but tonight she was untouchable. The grand banquet hall shimmered with golden lights. Guests dressed in their finest clothes laughed and toasted to a successful evening. The food had been the highlight, rich, flavorful, unforgettable. At the center of the room, the mayor stood, raising his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's feast was not just a meal. It was an experience crafted by a true master of the culinary arts, a chef whose talent has taken this city by storm." People leaned forward, eager to know the name of the mysterious chef. Kwabena, enjoying his drink, smirked. "Whoever made this food is truly gifted," he said, nudging his mother. Madam Ya nodded slowly, tapping her finger on the table. "It tastes familiar," she murmured, a frown forming on her face. The mayor smiled and gestured toward the entrance. "Let's give a warm round of applause to the one and only Esinam." The room went silent, then came the gasps. Kwabena's hand shook, nearly dropping his glass. Madame Ya's face drained of colour. Esinam walked in, dressed in a sleek, elegant chef's coat, embroidered with gold. She moved with quiet confidence, her head held high. Kwabena blinked, as if seeing a ghost. Madame Ya's breath hitched. This must be a mistake, she whispered. The guests, oblivious to the drama unfolding, clapped enthusiastically. Some even stood in admiration. Esinam walked up to the microphone, pausing for a moment. The hall was so silent that even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath. She smiled. "Thank you for your kind words, Mr. Mayor," she began. "It is an honor to serve tonight." She turned slightly, her eyes locking onto Kwabena and Madame Ya. They sat frozen, unable to look away. "Life has a funny way of bringing people back together, doesn't it?" she continued, her voice smooth, confident. "There was a time when I was told my place was beneath others, that I was not worthy unless I bowed, obeyed, and remained silent." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. Some guests exchanged glances, sensing a deeper story behind her words. "But," Esinam continued, lifting her chin, "I learned that my worth is not defined by those who refuse to see it. I built something of my own, and tonight I stand before you, not as a servant, but as a woman who has risen." The room erupted into applause, some even whistling in admiration. Kwabena's hands trembled. He looked at her, regret shining in his eyes. Madame Ya's lips pressed into a thin line, her fingers gripping the tablecloth. Esinam turned to the guests, raising her own glass. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice ringing with strength. The crowd repeated her words, raising their glasses high. But as Kwabena and his mother sat in stunned silence, it was clear Esinam had already won. The banquet hall was silent, all eyes on Esinam as she held the microphone. The golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over the guests, their faces filled with curiosity. The air was thick with anticipation. She took a deep breath, her fingers steady around the microphone. This was her moment, the moment she had never imagined, yet had always deserved. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice smooth and steady. "I want to thank the mayor for his kind word and for this opportunity." She paused, her eyes scanning the room, her gaze locked onto Kwabena and Madame Ya, who sat frozen at their table. Kwabena's face was pale, his jaw tight. Madame Ya's lips were pressed together, her hands clenching her dress. Esinam smiled, but there was no bitterness, only strength. "There was a time," she continued, "when I was told my place was beneath others. I was made to believe that obedience was more valuable than respect, that my dreams did not matter, that my voice should remain unheard." A few guests exchanged glances. The tension in the room thickened. Whispers began to spread. Esinam's voice remained calm, but it carried power. "I was thrown out of my own home with nothing, not because I was unfaithful, not because I was unkind, but because I dared to stand up for myself." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The realization was settling in. Kwabena's hands trembled on the table. He could feel the eyes of others turning toward him. He wanted to disappear. Madame Ya shifted uncomfortably, her posture stiff. Her grip on control, on power, was slipping right before her eyes. Esinam continued, her voice unwavering. "But life has a way of turning pain into strength, and strength into success." She lifted her chin slightly, her confidence filling the room. "Tonight, I do not stand before you as a woman who was cast aside. I stand here as a woman who built her own empire, a woman who no longer begs for a seat at anyone's table, because now I own my own." The room erupted into applause. It started with a few claps, hesitant yet impressed. Then, more joined in. Within moments, the entire hall was filled with thunderous applause. Some guests even stood, cheering for her. Esinam smiled, but her eyes held no malice, only peace. Kwabena's face burned with shame. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Madame Ya's pride had carried her for years, but tonight it crumbled. She was no longer the powerful matriarch. She was simply a woman who had underestimated the wrong daughter-in-law. Esinam stepped back from the microphone, her heart full. She had already won. Kwabena pushed through the crowd, his heart pounding. He had to talk to her. He had to make things right. Esinam stood near the grand stage, speaking with the mayor and a few distinguished guests. She was radiant, her confidence shining brighter than the golden lights in the hall. Kwabena hesitated. She looked so different from the woman he had thrown out, stronger, untouchable, but he had to try. "Esinam," he called, his voice low but urgent. She turned slowly, her expression unreadable. The hall bustled with laughter and conversation, but between them there was only silence. "Please," he said, stepping closer. "I made a mistake. Let's talk." For the first time that night, Esinam truly looked at him, not with love, not with anger, just with the calmness of a woman who had outgrown the man in front of her. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Kwabena," she said, her voice smooth yet firm. "The last time we spoke, you threw me away like garbage. Now you're the one looking for a seat at my table." Her words hit him like a slap. Kwabena swallowed hard. "I was wrong. She held up a hand, stopping him. "It doesn't matter anymore. I healed. I built a life without you, and I do not look back." He felt his throat tighten. "Esinam, You thought I would suffer without you," she interrupted, her eyes steady. "But look at me now, Kwabena. I am happier, I am stronger, and most importantly, I am free." She turned to leave, but before she did, she leaned in just slightly. "Enjoy your night," she said, smiling. "But remember, the best thing you ever lost was me." And with that, Esinam walked away, toward success, toward happiness, toward a future where Kwabena no longer existed. Kwabena stood there, frozen, watching the woman he had once controlled slip out of his reach forever. He had lost everything, and this time there was no way to get it back. Madame Ya had always walked with her head high, her presence commanding respect wherever she went. People feared her sharp tongue and powerful connections. She had built a reputation as a woman who controlled her household and the people around her. But tonight, everything changed. The whispers had started the moment Esinam spoke. Guests murmured, glancing at Madame Ya with disapproval. Some shook their heads, others exchanged knowing looks. The respect she once demanded had turned into quiet judgment. "She threw out a woman like that," someone whispered. "All because of pride," another guest muttered. Madame Ya's face burned. She straightened her back, trying to ignore the stares, but they only grew worse. By the time the banquet ended, she could barely walk through the crowd without feeling their eyes on her. People who used to bow in her presence now avoided her gaze. Some even whispered directly as she passed. Her friends, the women who once admired her, slowly drifted away. One by one, they turned their backs, afraid of being associated with a woman who had humiliated her own daughter-in-law, only to watch that same daughter-in-law rise above her. Even at home, the whispers did not stop. The workers in her household, once obedient, now spoke in hushed voices behind her back. The respect she had used to control them had vanished. Kwabena, too, had changed. He barely spoke to her. He avoided her eyes. He carried his own shame, and for the first time, he no longer looked at his mother as the woman who had all the answers. Madame Ya sat in her once grand living room, staring at nothing. She had built her world on power, but power without love meant nothing. She had controlled her son, but he no longer listened. She had ruled her home, but it was now empty. She had demanded respect, but now all she had left were whispers and shame. Her greatest mistake had not been losing Esinam. It had been thinking that she would never need her. Esinam no longer looked back. The day she walked out of Kwabena's life, she left behind all the pain, all the tears, and all the time she had begged for love. She was no longer the woman who waited for approval. She was now a woman who built her own future. Her small food business grew faster than she ever imagined. People loved her cooking, and soon she was catering for the biggest events in the city. Orders came from everywhere, and within months, she opened her first restaurant. Then came another, and another. Before long, Esinam's name was known across the country. She was no longer just a chef. She was a businesswoman, a leader, an inspiration. She no longer cared about who had hurt her in the past. She was too busy creating a future full of joy, success, and freedom. Meanwhile, Kwabena's life was falling apart. Without Esinam, nothing was the same. He thought life would be easy without her, but he quickly realized how much she had done for him. His home felt empty. His meals no longer had the warmth of her touch. His business, once steady with her support, started to struggle, and worst of all, the respect he once had from others was fading. People whispered about how he had thrown away a woman who had become more powerful than he ever imagined. His friends slowly distanced themselves. Even his mother, Madame Ya, was no longer the strong woman she used to be. One evening, Kwabena sat alone in his house, staring at the wall. He had everything once: wealth, a loving wife, a strong reputation. Now, all he had left was regret. Esinam, on the other hand, stood on the balcony of her newest restaurant, looking out at the bright city lights. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool breeze against her skin. She had won, not because she had destroyed Kwabena, but because she had freed herself. She had built a life where she never had to beg for love again. The night was magical. Golden lights sparkled across the grand hall, and the air buzzed with excitement. The opening of Esinam's 5-star restaurant was the most talked about event of the year. Journalists, business leaders, and celebrities had all come to celebrate the woman who had risen from nothing to build an empire. Esinam stood tall in the center of the room, wearing a stunning dress that made her glow like a queen. She looked around and smiled. This was her moment. The waiters moved gracefully, serving her signature dishes, flavors that had once been ignored but now brought people from all over the country. Every table was filled, and every guest was in awe. Then it was time. The host tapped the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the woman who made this night possible, Esinam." The crowd erupted in applause as she stepped forward. She took a deep breath, her heart full, her voice strong. "I was once told that a woman's place was to serve in silence," she began. "I was thrown out of my own home for refusing to kneel. I was told I was nothing without a husband. But today, I stand before you, not as a servant, not as someone's wife, but as a woman who built her own future." The room was silent. Every eye was on her. "The strongest women," she continued, "are the ones who rise after being pushed down." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Then someone started clapping, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall erupted into applause. Cheers filled the room as people stood up, honoring her journey, her strength, her victory. Esinam raised her glass. "To every woman who has ever been told she is not enough, this is for you." As she took a sip, she knew she had won, not just against those who doubted her, not just against Kwabena or Madame Ya. She had won against the past that tried to break her. She had won the greatest victory of all, her freedom.